Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of From the Lighthouse. Now I don't have my wonderful co-host Michelle here because she just, had better things to do today. So I do have our producer Jimmy here with me. Hi Jimmy.
Hi Steph, because I have nothing better to do, obviously.
Yeah, Jimmy's got nothing better to do today, and Jimmy was really begged me to be on this podcast because this is his favourite genre that we're going to be talking
Slight
about.
Exaggeration. But okay.
So I'm here with a colleague of ours, Associate Professor Hsu-Ming Teo, who teaches in the Department of English, and she is our resident expert on all things romance. And so we wanted to talk to you about your research on romance. So welcome, Hsu-Ming.
Thank you, Stephanie, and hi, Jimmy.
So let's start by thinking about why you wanted to study romance academically.
Right, okay. I sort of got into romance by accident because I did my PhD work on women's travel writing of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And a lot of the women who went traveling went back, when they got home, they wrote exotic romance novels about the places that they'd been to. So in addition to reading their travel writings, I was reading their romance novels. And of course, one of the first ones I came across was Edith Maud Hull, E.M. Hull's The Sheik. So I had read her travel book, Camping in the Sahara. And when I read The Sheik, it was quite different. And so I started getting very interested in romance. The more about the scholarship I read, the more interested I got in it.
I should have mentioned too that you are the author of Desert Passions, Orientalism and Romance, and also that you are writing at the moment an entry on romance for the Oxford Research Encyclopedia of Literature. Sorry, my brain is gone today. So you're well immersed in the romance kind of genre. So what are you studying at the moment in relation to romance?
Okay, there's a couple of things that I'm doing, I suppose, for the Oxford Research Encyclopedia of Literature entry. I'm just basically introducing romance as, romance scholarship.
Yeah.
And the whole field that has developed since the 1980s or late 1970s, really. The scholarship has changed quite dramatically, quite considerably. So that's that. I'm also starting work on another project. It's a monograph that I want to write about history in the romance novel. And this will look at historical romances, but it's going to look at how the past is represented in romance and how problem histories particularly crop up in romance. So things that I'm looking at, for example, are medieval romances, Regency romances. I'm very interested in African American romances because I was doing a bit of research on this, and I found out that a lot of African American women learn about their past and engage with their own history and a sense of heritage by reading romance novels. So these romances play a very important role in passing on historical knowledge as well as culture. I'm also interested in more problematic histories, as in the Holocaust. So I've been working on the Holocaust for quite some time, and there are indeed Holocaust romances, which seems to be
yeah.
complete oxymoron. I mean, why would you set a romance, a love story in the midst of a Holocaust? But there are quite a few. So when I got over my initial, I have to admit, shock and a bit of a revulsion, I started to be really intrigued by these Holocaust romances because, apart from the question of why would you do that, there was, then I thought, well, what kinds of histories are being transmitted through the romance novel? Does the genre of romance actually distort the history of the Holocaust? And then, similarly, how is history impacted when you write it as a romance in the genre of the romance? So I'm interested in, I guess, in history and fiction in the form of the Holocaust romance. And another thing I'm interested in and that I've just been working on is about the culture of romantic love in China. Historically, that did not exist in the same way as we understand it in the West, and yet there's quite a body of work on historical romances in China being produced since the 21st century. So it's really interesting to see how they map that onto historical and cultural conditions which were completely different from the West, where romance arose. Yeah, so that's basically, I guess, the book.
There's so much to go over there, but maybe a good place to start is maybe you can define romance for us, because I think that some people get a bit kind of confused about the difference between a romance novel and a love story.
Okay. Yes, this is probably one of the hardest and most ambiguous terms to define, because if you do an internet search on romance novels, all kinds of really strange things come up. So, I mean, obviously, it's ambiguous because if you wanted to trace the roots of the romance novel, you have to go back to the Middle Ages and the rise of, I guess, of the French romances. But I think for my purposes, I'm looking at romance as a genre in the way that the industry describes it. So it's so the industry describes it as a genre which is focused on a love story, which has a happy ending. So it's just two very, very basic requirements. It has to have a love story. It has to center on the romantic protagonists, and it has to have a happy ending. Right. So that's what the industry, and by the industry I mean the publishers, the readers, the writers, and the booksellers. That's what they understand as a romance, in terms of a romance novel. Because that fits reader expectations. A love story, on the other hand, is quite different because all kinds of works could be a love story, but you could have a happy ending or a sad ending. It doesn't necessarily have to focus on the love relationship. So in terms of, I guess from the commercial point of view, it's quite different, even though readers might mix them up and think, well, reading something like, I'm reading Nicholas Sparks, there's love
I was thinking of Nicholas Sparks as you were talking.
Yes, so it's a romance, but he himself is very adamant that he writes love stories and not romance.
Is that because he's a boy?
Partly. But, I mean, I think that the romance writers of America have statistics that show, I think maybe about 10 to 15% of romance writers are male.
Yeah, I saw that. I remember being not shocked, but thinking that was a high proportion compared to what I kind of thought would be the case.
Yeah.
It's such a genre associated with women, isn't it?
Yeah, well, there was that wonderful film in the 90s, what's it called? As Good as It Gets, with Jack Nicholson as a romance writer, quite a popular romance writer. And actually there was quite a few now I'm thinking about it. Misery was another one about a romance writer.
Paperback Hero as well, with Hugh Jackman.
Yeah, and he tries to hide the fact that he's a romance writer. So I think it is quite, it's there, it's hidden,
there,
and there is a stigma, I guess, associated with romance, that it should be more of a woman's genre, and for men it's a guilty pleasure. Yeah. And certainly I felt that it was a guilty pleasure when I was reading it as a teenager back then, and it was something that I used to hide. Boys would hide Playboys, and here I am hiding romance.
You've always been a bit special.
I know, it was very special. Yeah. But that definition you made was quite interesting, because I remember in the midst of all my romance reading, I was trying to read as much as I possibly could at the time. I heard about Gone with the Wind. Right. And I thought, oh, well, it's sold as the greatest love story of all time. And I thought, well, I must read this romance novel. And I read it, and it ended. I thought, this isn't the formula that I like. Why would it end like this? This is horrible. I don't like this ending at all.
So it's a love story, not a romance.
Yes, exactly. And I thought that was actually, that really defined the difference for me. Gone with the Wind was a love story. Well, is a love story, I should say. I like it much better now, but the first time I read it, I did have a reaction to it because it didn't follow that formula that you were talking about.
Yes.
It did focus on the love story, but it also didn't at the same time. I think the war played quite a big backdrop for it, whereas other stories that I was used to reading did have that exact focus that you were talking about. It was, the love story of the protagonist, and then it always ended quite happily. Yeah. And that probably explains my warped childhood, because Disney was another big influence on me. And again, love story, happy ending. Yeah. So,
well, I mean, you find it as far back as Shakespeare's comedies, right? I mean, that's that's the genesis of the modern romance. So the comedies always end happily, no matter what happens. Like, it can be very tragic, but it ends happily, right?
And that's why I suppose Shakespeare also translates very, very well into romance genre for those who adapt Shakespeare.
Yeah, so the genre, I think, is quite elastic in that sense. People associate the genre with Mills and Boon and all the category romances, all the bodice rippers, with half-dressed heroes and heroines and all of that. But if you just focus on the structure of the romance, Pride and Prejudice, Jane Austen's novels are romance. A Room with a View, E.M. Forster's A Room with a View is a romance. A.S. Byatt's Possession, subtitled romance. Yeah, so it does cross over into the literary, except I suppose. And if you think about, most 19th century novels do, work as romances. It's in the 20th century, I guess, with skyrocketing divorce rates that people, become disenchanted with a literary romance.
Well, I wanted to pick up on a point that Jimmy made about hiding romance novels because I actually set my feminism class this year. I set them a task, which was to go and read a romance novel and talk about it in class. And a lot of them were very kind of, I don't want to be seen in public reading this. Why do we have this sneery attitude towards romance when it's so popular? I mean, in terms of sheer numbers, it really powers the publishing sector.
Yes, well, partly because it's women's fiction. You can't get around that fact because men read similarly formulaic types of fiction, westerns, spy
James
novels,
Patterson.
Military sagas and things like that. There's a similar formula, but it's okay because it's manly, it's aggressive, it deals with things in the public sphere, whereas things in the private sphere, what goes on in personal lives, in families, relationships, all of that is denigrated and not particularly valued. So it's so again we have this public-private split, male-female split. What is economically productive, and what is what sustains society but is not monetarily rewarded, right?
And it's so stupid because men are involved in these things too. Men have domestic lives, men have marriages, men have romances, and yet we so associate that so closely with women.
But I also suppose because of the success of Mills and Boon, and then Silhouette and now Harlequin Enterprises, which has taken over all category romances, they put out so much romance, so many volumes. I once read a statistic on the Harlequin website that if you put every Harlequin book end to end, you could reach the moon and back 11 times.
Oh, wow.
That is a lot of
books. I thought you were going to say the moon and back, full stop, not 11 times.
So there's a lot of stuff there, and there's a lot of junk. There's a lot of writing which is not particularly good. So it also becomes denigrated because it is associated with poor writing. And also, I think, really from a scholarly point of view, intriguing things happen with the genre in terms of how readers read it. So that over time, those who are reading category romances, so the categories are like the ones which come out as a series, like every month or so, like with Harlequins. And if you read the early to mid 20th century ones, they're a lot more like the realist novel, the Victorian novel. You read the ones by the end of the 20th century and the 21st century, and they're a lot more stylized. And if you come into the genre for the first time and you read this this 200-page novel, a lot of it might not make sense. And why? And that is the case because they're skipping a lot of things that readers are filling in. It's the plot in the categories have become a lot more stylized because writers sometimes depend on readers to do the work of filling it in. So it's interesting in that regard.
I've done a bit of reading on romance scholarship, and I'm interested in the difference between old school romance and new school romance. Okay. I was wondering if you could speak to that.
Yes, old school is actually from the 70s, and that's related to the first wave of romance, feminist romance scholarship. So it was in the 70s. It actually began, I think, pretty much with Germaine Greer and the Female Unit, just absolutely excoriating romance for what it did in terms of enslaving women to patriarchy and making them happy with their lot. But after that, all the feminist scholarship that comes out in the late 70s and early and 1980s is pretty much from the feminist point of view, worrying that women are being indoctrinated by romances, and then pulling up a few category romances, a few Mills and Boons or Harlequins to show how how detrimental these role models were to women's lives. And the types of romances that they looked at were really from the 70s and 80s. So it was very ahistorical, because what happens in the 70s and 80s is that you have, the romance becoming a bit more sexualized, a greater focus on sexual tension, but an inability to describe sexuality and erotic encounters in a more natural way. So what romance writers did was to heighten, the battle of the sexes. You had, uber alpha males who are very, very unpleasant, and helpless, passive, feminine heroines. And that becomes old school romance, the helpless heroine and the very masculine hero. It's really interesting because if you read from the early 20th century, you don't find the same kinds of romantic protagonists, because masculinity and femininity changes over time. So, but that's really what I guess what readers and the industry refers to as old school romance. New school romance, the heroine, this is post-feminism. She's independent, she works. It's really about the heroine more than the hero, because you can still have old school heroes who are then transformed by the new school heroine. But the heroine has autonomy, and she's complete in herself. I think that's probably the biggest difference. She doesn't need a man to complete her. She doesn't need marriage or domesticity to complete her. That's, that's the cherry on a fabulously iced, wonderfully rich cake already. So she's got a very, satisfying life, and the man is just a bonus. He's not the be-all and end-all in the way he might have been in an old school romance.
One of the kind of sticking points with old school romance is that it often features sexual violence.
Yes.
And often the heroine will fall in love subsequently with her rapist.
Yes.
And that's been, for obvious reasons, a huge point of controversy. How do you read that kind of interest in rape in the old school romance?
It's very problematic.
Yeah.
First of all, I guess readers would say there is a difference between fantasy and reality. And for all the feminist scholars who are sort of worrying about, women becoming habituated to, to rape and to domestic violence, readers, they didn't talk to readers at that time, but readers were very clear that, there is a difference. We do understand that there is a difference between fantasy and reality. So that's one thing, and fantasies of sexual violence, they go back a long way in our culture. You find them all in 18th, 19th century pornography, as you well know, right? Yeah, but the other thing, I suppose, is that that sexual violence and the use of rape, as a technique of seduction, is again very historically specific to the 70s and 80s. Which is not to say that it doesn't occur in novels which are published in the 21st century, as authors try and go back and see whether they can redeem that. I don't find that it is redeemable, but some readers do enjoy reading it, and but it's very specific to that period of time, and it's again to do with what I referred to before as the sexualization of the romance novel. Yeah. So when they're moving away from chaste romances and what they now call in the industry sweet romances, and they're trying to become a bit more sexualized, but they don't know how to write about sex in a way that would be acceptable to readers. And they're not experimenting hugely because of commercial considerations. So with series romances, with all the big romances, it's always about I guess markets consideration is the most important thing. So for Mills and Boon, for example, when editorial decisions were made in London, they have to consider not just what Australian readers might put up with, but what South African readers might put up with, what like Southern American Baptist readers might put up with. So it took a long time, I guess, for romance writers, particularly those writing category romances, to experiment with sexuality. But what they could do to keep the heroine innocent, old school, and to introduce sex was to have her raped. Right, so it's a terrible plot device, but that's what happens with The Flame and the Flower, Kathleen Woodwiss's first bodice ripper of 1972, where the heroine is raped several times by the completely repugnant hero, and then she comes to love him, but most importantly, in the process of loving, he becomes domesticated, and Jodie McAllister calls this love as sexually transmitted branded disease, right? So, it's what the hero catches. So, especially in the historical romances of the 70s by people like Beatrice Small or Rosemary Rogers, when they were trying to write a lot more spicy erotic romances but didn't quite know how to, rape featured as an element because it sort of kept the old school heroine innocent and pure, and yet it introduced sexuality and sexual activity into the novel. Have to say that by the late 70s, early 80s, readers were really protesting against this, right? So the industry started to change because of that. Writers started to change because readers were just saying, look, enough of that already. And so you get the introduction of the, I guess, like the new school hero who is very American, very boyish, very charming, sort of like the boy next door from the 80s onwards.
We've talked about this before, and I remember you saying to me something that I thought was really interesting, which is that old school romances, even when they use these rapes as a kind of plot device, I suppose, at least the heroine doesn't die.
Yes. I mean, Jennifer Cruzy, who is a romance writer I like very much because she's very funny. She has said that one of the things that she loves when she first started reading romance, because she was a literature major, and she said everybody died. Tess, right?
Clarissa, Clarissa,
yeah. Exactly. So all of these heroines, virtuous heroines, die when they have sex, right? And she said, God, to read a story for the first time where a woman gets to have sex and doesn't die,
Yeah. She ends the novel alive. It's a victory.
That's right.
Yeah.
So, so that was one of the appeals of E.M. Hull's The Sheik, that the heroine, who is this cold tomboy, and who's raped by the Sheik until she falls in love with him, despite all of that, she doesn't die, and she goes on to live a happy, fulfilled life. Right, and I think that was one of the appeals and why readers will overlook the rape scenes as well. But I also think, I have a theory that in the 70s, when because in my historical research I did a lot of stuff on history of rape, right, and rape politics. American feminist politics was absolutely saturated by anti-rape politics. You had Susan Brown Miller's Against Our Will, every man is a potential rapist and all of that. And, and there was so much anti-rape politics and so much fear of men that they did a study on U.S. campuses in the early 80s and showed that, American college women were far more afraid of being raped than they were of being murdered. Right, so there was this big fear. And in some ways, I wonder whether these stories are not a response to the rape politics of the time, right? Not that they're saying that rape doesn't matter, but that, it's not the end of the world. Because in a lot of the novels, the stories, the rape stories are distasteful, but not only does the heroine live, she actually triumphs and overcomes. She's not permanently scarred forever, and reduced to this shriveling, whimpering husk of a woman, but she goes on, she transforms the hero, she transforms her world as well, because it's like, okay, that happened, it was really bad, but I move on with my life. And I wonder whether some of that kind of thinking, a refusal to keep women as victims is not entering into some of the politics of these novels as well.
That's interesting, because that's quite a kind of feminist message, isn't it? That, that recovery is possible. It's not going to destroy you. It's not going to. Yes, it's not the thing that defines you.
It's more third wave feminist message than a second wave one.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Well, you talked about how the kind of second wave feminists were very down on romance and how that's shifted. I was wondering if you could talk about that shift in the way romance is perceived in the academy, because it's not something that would have been studied kind of academically until, say, the 70s, 80s, 90s.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, so, Q.D. Leavis wrote about it, right? Dismissing all of those secretaries and all that who read romances and shop girls, right? Always like the shop girl. I guess feminist scholars, as I said, were worried about women. I think they actually didn't really know many women readers, so they had this idea, and everything then, I guess, in terms of reader response was it was just about images, right? You had to provide images of good images, and role models for women to follow. It was in many ways, although they didn't recognize it at the time, an infantilizing of women, right? They're like kids. You have to give them good role models, and romance heroes, heroines relationships were not. So a lot of the feminist scholarship that came out was about that. It was also, I guess it was also part of this whole, this whole Marxist school of hegemony, right? So if all of these women are reading books, romances that reconcile themselves, reconcile them to patriarchy, to husbands, to domesticity and family life, where's the revolution?
Yeah,
going
they
to
won't
come
rise
from,
up.
right?
They'll be placated.
Yeah. So and of course, when romance writers finally wrote a response to the feminist criticism. So it, romance writers got together and published a book called Dangerous Men, Adventurous Women, and it was looking at what they thought that they were doing in terms of romance writing, and the readers. They were saying, it is romance. It's not a feminist manifesto. There is a difference, right? But it was also interesting because the readers understood something about, the writers understood something about the readers that the feminist critics did not, and that was that reading was a much more complex process than what the critics thought. So Laura Kinsale, for example, who was a romance writer, said that when readers read, they don't just identify with the heroine and then it matters whether she's a good role model or not. They identify with the hero as well and use the heroine as a place marker, sort of like a Monopoly iron or Monopoly shoe, right? To chart their way through the romance. Right. So she's the placeholder through the narrative, and they're playing this game. And in the end, I guess I always like to say that, well, to people who say that romance is formulaic, it is formulaic in the way that chess is formulaic. There are all of these rules. There are certain things that you can and can't do, and the ending in chess is always checkmate, and in a romance novel, it's always happily ever after. And I think writers understood that a lot more than the critics. So that was, I guess, the first wave of feminist criticism. Then there was sort of a lull in the 90s, which was when I started writing about romance novels, because I was interested particularly in Said's Orientalism and how there was this spate of Orientalist historical novels, romance novels from the 70s onwards, and then there was a revival of Orientalist romances from the 90s, and in fact it peaked after September 11, right, the September 11 attacks, and it's still going really strong today. So I came into studying romance novels because I was interested in the phenomenon of Orientalism. And when I had a look at it, there were a lot of other things that were interesting about the genre, not just feminism and whether it's there are good models or not. And there was Orientalism. There was the legacy of British imperialism, American neo-imperialism. How this is translated into the books and all of that. So and then by the end of I guess by the 21st century, I found I connected with a lot of other scholars who are doing work in much more interesting areas, I guess, and also different kinds of, I guess, subgenres of romance. So that feminism is still important, but it's, I guess, it's much more complex now. And the difference is that critics are reading romances in a formalist way, rather than just a simplistic media way that where you just focus on good or bad images.
Well, I mean, all of these arguments about women being susceptible to the images they read in romance, it's exactly the same in the 18th century. Women are going to read novels and have their head turned and not going to be satisfied with ordinary life because, the novel makes it sound much more sexy than it is.
Yes.
So these are just old arguments that are now being applied to romance. And what's underpinning all these arguments is the idea that women read in this really simplistic way, where they'll just read a novel and go, okay, life should be like that, men should be like that, and don't have a kind of critical function or a capacity to read in a much more complex way. So it's really quite a reductive argument.
Yes.
I was wondering too if you could talk about more about the rise of Orientalist romance and then the plateau and then the rise again. What do you put that down to?
Okay. Well, I mean, it first comes about at the in the early 20th century. So I mentioned E.M. Hals the Sheikh, but Orientalist romance has preceded Hals the Sheikh. And for that first wave, I guess, it's really to do with British imperialism, right? And that's why the women travelers that I had studied and went back and wrote romances about the Middle Eastern desert and Orientalist princes and all of that kind of stuff, except that they never crossed the racial bar, right? Because and even Hull doesn't do that because her Arab sheikh turns out to be an English earl in disguise, right?
Oh, much safer. Yeah.
Yes, but it was that period when Britain and France were expanding into the Middle East, right, as the Ottoman Empire and its influence over that region was declining. That's when we have the first wave of interest in, romance, love stories set in the Orient. The Orient meaning, I guess, from North Africa, the Middle East, to I guess to about the Indian subcontinent. That's
a lot of the world. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. It's sort of there were so many Orientalist romances, desert romances being produced in the 20s particularly. I think there was just a glut of them, a surfeit of them, and then people lost interest in them. And I think particularly by the end of the 20s, Britain is facing all kinds of insurgencies, anti-colonial insurgencies in the Middle East. It's a pretty nasty situation. It's just not romantic anymore, right? And so there's this lull. There's not really anything much produced until the end of the 60s when a romance novelist, a British romance novelist called Violet Winspear, decides to try and revive the Orientalist romance novel. So she does a revised version of E.M. Hals the Sheikh. Right.
Is he actually from the Middle East this time, or is he still English?
No, he's still English.
Oh, there we go.
They don't actually become fully Arab or fully Muslim or fully, non-English, non-European. They've got French background lots of the time, or Spanish, right? So French and Spanish backgrounds are really popular. That's in the 70s. It's not until the 80s really that and it's really, I think, more in American ones, where where you have, I guess, in American terms, Caucasian and Arab, right, romances, yeah.
And so you said that it sort of peaked after 9/11. What do you think was going on there?
Look, I think throughout the 80s there was a few Sheikh romances produced. Australian novelists started to dabble in it. Lynn Wilding was the first in 1990 or 91. She wrote a book called The Sheikh. With an Australian protagonist, Emma Darcy, who was a husband and wife team, Frank and Wendy Brennan, until he died, and then Wendy Brennan kept writing alone as Emma Darcy. But Emma Darcy has produced quite a few Sheikh romances. There's only a handful of American ones, and then and they only appear in the 90s, and I think it's after the first Persian Gulf War. After Saddam Hussein, and Iraq invades Kuwait, and so after Desert Storm, I think for the first time American media was saturated with the images of all of these, all of these sheikhs and Muslims. But the difference from previous, I guess, representations was they were seeing, so-called good Arabs for the first time in the form of Kuwaiti princes and all of that, and it was all pretty glamorous. So this kind of stuff had been happening in Britain, prior to that. But the interest is really after Desert Storm, and then after 9/11, I thought that it would peak because who wants to read? About these romances,
such a politically charged thing,
of terrorism. But interestingly, there's more and more produced. And then one thing I realized was happening, by the time I was writing the final chapters for my book, Desert Passions, Orientalism and Romance Novels. When I looked at the books which came out since 9/11, I realized that these were actually xenophilic attempts at anti-racist agendas, right? So the romance novelists, the books are still Orientalist, definitely. But what they're trying to do is to use the romance novel as a medium for showing human relationships right? That and for humanizing rather than demonizing the figure of the Arab or the Muslim. So it's very interesting in that respect, and for undermining dominant mainstream media stereotypes of Muslims as terrorists or dangerous or whatever. There's an American author, Suzanne Brockman, who I think on her website she deliberately stated that she's doing this kind of thing, writing multicultural romances to try and normalize, humanize, integrate Arab American, Muslim Americans into the mainstream.
It seems like that's happening a lot from what I've been reading about romance, taking on these kind of dominant scripts about race, about even about gender, and really using the romance novel as a way to confront a lot of these kind of quite controversial or discussed aspects of kind of the way we think about culture and society. Yes,
and I think there's always been a minority of romance writers who wanted to engage with, I guess, the big political questions of their time. So I know, like during the civil rights movement, there were a number of romance novelists with Mills and Boon who were well established, and they tried to write like African white romances. They tried to push an anti-racist agenda, a civil rights agenda, but their works, those particular works, never sought to print. We've got a few histories of Mills and Boon which show that the editor Alan Boone just shut them down because he was thinking about the Southern American market, and also the South African market, which were important markets to him. And in the end, he said that Mills and Boon like their characters to be uncolored.
Oh my gosh.
Yes. So so it's not that the writers couldn't; it's whether they were able to to get their works into print, right? And this is in the end a commercial business for them. Once the Americans, American publishers entered into the romance market and set up, rival publishing companies and publishing outlets for romance writers. From the 80s onwards, the possibilities of what you can publish expand. And a lot of it is due to publisher politics, publisher decisions based on market decisions. Because at the same time that Mills and Boon was shutting down interracial romances, Collins in Australia published a few romances where there was Australian characters with Japanese love interests. They were secondary romances, but it was there, and they were able to do it because they were quite a small publisher, so they could take more risks. And so if we skip forward to the present moment, right, in the 21st century, digital publishing, e-books has absolutely exploded the market and made it possible for people to publish all kinds of romances, niche romances. The subgenres just keep proliferating, and also to make their political statements if they want to. Right now, they might not sell that many, but they generate a lot of discussion. So I was at a conference at Williams College, Massachusetts, in April, and there was a very famous American historical romance writer. And I think she was quite exasperated at another American historical romance writer called Courtney Milan, who has just come out with a new series of Asian American books where she is challenging not just straight overt racism, but aversive racism. It's a lot of racial politics. It's very, very clever, right? In this book, it's called Trade Me. And anyway, so this more traditional American historical romance writer was saying, that's it. She's tagged as a romance novelist. People are not interested because they don't want to be confronted with racial politics and all of that in a romance novel. It's supposed to be escapist. Look at her sales numbers. They have pancaked, right? So for this more traditional romance writer, it was all about sales. But Courtney Milan still sells. She might not sell as much, but because she self-publishes, and she's got a massive following as well, and a huge presence on social media, and and so she's using, I guess, her profile to promote her kind of politics and to explore the different political agendas.
It seems to me that romance readers and writers are very technologically savvy and very experimental in the ways they engage with the for the writers, with the reading public, and for the readers, with the formats in which they're
Yes.
likely to engage with novels. I remember reading that those novel subscription services like Scribd and Oyster in America were actually tanked because romance readers read too much. And so it kind of broke their model of how they were going to, engage with the marketplace, because they're such kind of voracious readers, and they'll do things like hop on the ebook, train before everybody else will, and so they're quite savvy.
Yes, they are, definitely. I think they were some of the earliest adopters of technology, but even more than that, marketing practices. So the whole idea of reducing a novel, right, to a brand and a package, right, which is what Mills and Boon did, and ensuring, a regular, subscription base, right. That was really novel, It was so creative in terms of publishing history, and then in terms of ebook publishing, romance. Romance writers were among the first to take up this digital technology, partly because of the stigma of people reading romances.
Yes, it's easy to pretend you're not reading a romance if it's a Kindle.
I was going to say, I wish I had it as a teenager. I would have just, give out even more romance novels, because the anonymity would have helped really greatly. And I think, one of the other things that I kind of want to get your opinion a little bit on too is one of the most embarrassing things for me about reading a romance novel was actually the cover. Yeah. These covers were just awful because they had usually Fabio. I don't know why it's always Fabio, but
he made a lot of money on
he
those
did.
covers,
It was always him in different outfits, different style, and then a woman sort of draped over his body like that he's standing tall and everything. And it was just so obscene to a 14-year-old child who just wants to get to the really interesting love story aspects of it. And they were always like that. So I always avoided those sort of books. I always avoided Mills and Boon's because of the reputation of Mills and Boon's. It's women's fiction, so you shouldn't be reading that. And I always gravitated then towards the novels that were romance, but didn't seem obviously romance. I mean, they seemed girlish in the sense that they'll have abstract pictures of flowers or pretty colours or something to that effect. So I always went for those sort of romance because they were safer. I could always disguise them as something of more academic value or not a romance, and I devoured those ones. But interestingly enough, when I was brave enough to start buying the other ones, I realised that my reading habits were more sophisticated as a result of reading the non-generic ones. So the ones that weren't marketed towards obvious romance reads. So I was reading works by Lavelle Spencer, Judith McNaught, Sandra Brown. So a lot of writers who tend to move between genres as well. So they didn't like to stick to just the one genre. The crime thriller ones, and maybe that's when my first crime fiction interest began. And also writers who put a lot of research into creating these complex worlds. So one of my favourite writers was Judith McNaught, and what I loved about her was that she took me to the Victorian period, or she took me to the medieval period, and she told me about the customs and the discourse of that particular period, and that's what I was learning through that. And so then when I read Mills and Boon's, and it was just very formulaic. Once you've read one, it seems like you've basically read all the others to some extent. Whereas with her, there was some sort of formulaic thing involved, but it was just all the things that were filling in, all the things that she was padding it with, that was much more interesting than that formula. And for me, that was the fascinating thing about reading romance. I was learning new things all the time. And even now, when I try to find the origins of why I know some certain trivias, I can probably trace it back to a romance novel that I read somewhere along the lines. Like, someone asked me, well, how do you know about, dukes and earls and, where they rank and all that? I said, well, I don't really want to admit this, but it was because I read a lot of historical romance fiction, and they told me very clearly Duke was pretty much at the top of the ladder, and then, it wasn't from academic research or anything like that. It was actually through, it was through these particular novels. So, do you see the covers in a way as having any impact on the content?
Yes and no. I mean, like what you're describing is the difference, which I didn't make clear earlier, between category romances and single title romances. So the category ones are the Mills and Boons, the Harlequins. The ones you're interested in, which are mainly the ones that I read as well, are the single titles. So as long as they loosely have meeting, conflict, relationship, happy ending, anything goes, right? So those are the really interesting ones because you can do all kinds of wonderful things with them. You can explore new worlds. It's what you make of it. So the single titles, I completely agree, are much more interesting to read. I probably, if I have to read romances, it will probably be the thriller horror, / crime. There's nothing quite like getting me in the mood for romance as a good murder.
I mean, but there were some really strange ones too. I remember I picked up a collection of supernatural romance ones.
Yes,
and I was never quite the same after that, because I thought, that just went into a territory I'm not quite sure how I feel about that.
Yes, well, I mean, the J.R. Ward Dark Lover series, the Black Brother Daggerhood, that is so incredibly popular, not just about among women, but really popular among young men, because they're all about these really, really violent, like hip-hop loving vampires, right?
Yeah,
so
sex with vampires and ghosts and werewolves, and
yes.
a part of me just sort of went, I don't know if I feel comfortable going into this particular territory, but it has, as I said, expanded much more, and it's probably become the more dominant, especially with the rise of something like Twilight.
Yes, that's right.
Which essentially is playing off that particular genre.
Yeah. So I agree. But in terms of the cover, I think the cover definitely is very semiotic. It definitely signals what kind of romance you're going to get. So I mean, it's very carefully arranged. The bodice rippers of the 70s and 80s, all the Fabio covers, I mean, it did wonders for Fabio's career. He wouldn't have his American talk show host thing and all of that if it hadn't been for the fame that he gained.
And we all know his name.
Covers.
We all know who
Exactly.
he is. Yeah.
And he's such a star at romance writers, of America conferences in the.
Has he still got long hair?
90s.
Of course, he's still got
I
long
have
hair.
no idea. I haven't seen him recently,
probably.
but yeah. But I mean, if you think about the novelty of those covers back then too, when you had quite bland covers of the 70s, right, washed out colors and all of that, and suddenly you have especially the first bodice rippers, you've got these covers that pop. They are erotic, they're racy, they're not like anything that you've ever seen before, and then the gold leaf as well. Yeah. I mean, I thought they were hideous then. I'm very nostalgic about them now because they don't really have those kinds of covers now. No. They have very tame, pretty covers now.
It seems to be
in
now.
Boss too. It's almost like Fabio was jumping out at you.
Yes,
that's right.
His pecs, sort of sticking out at you.
Now there just seems to be girls in dresses.
That's right. Or houses, mansions. So those told women back then during the romance revolution, when romance novels became sexualized, that this, if you want to read about sex, this is the book to pick up, right? So it was an obvious marketing tool. Yeah, the Sandra Brown ones I think are interesting because she has always styled herself more as, I guess, like a sort of crime thriller with, a genre with romance thrown in. So they've got more abstract covers, I guess, Karen Roberts is another one as well. But with the Black Dagger Brotherhood, the J.R. Ward series, and the paranormals, you can tell that they are paranormals because they're so dark. It's like, like you've got these blacks and greys and reds, right? So the covers definitely signal the subgenre and the content, and also, I guess, the level of sexuality in some ways.
Yeah, I mean, those bodice ripper that you described, whenever I did pick up one, it was basically what you said. Almost every single one of them had a rape scene of some sort. It could have been a coincidence, but every single one that I've read of those, there was always a rape scene. I thought, why do they always get raped in these ones and not in these other ones that I read?
But I mean, in some ways, it's also you reading it as a rape scene, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, it was interesting because my first encounter with a rape scene in a romance novel was through a work by Judith McNaught, and that was quite an interesting portrayal because it was focalized through the female character, and so it was actually her. She wasn't enjoying it, and the male character was actually quite repulsed by the entire action, and he felt quite a bit ashamed by it. So my first introduction to that sort of depiction was one of negativity. This was not a positive thing to see. So from that moment onwards, I sort of read everything of a rape nature as being quite a negative thing. So it was quite a clever device that McNaught uses to describe what rape could have been like. I mean, of course, she does convert him and turns into this lovely gentleman at the end, but it was a negative scene. And so when I read it in other novels where it wasn't depicted so much as a negative scene, I didn't quite know what to do with that because I just sort of went, well, I think I should see this as negative, but she seems to be enjoying it, so I don't know what exactly am I doing here, and what am I doing with this scene? So I didn't respond well to those novels, mainly because of the way I was introduced to because that type of
Yes,
material.
that's really interesting because your experience is probably not uncommon, because like because those covers do appear on the historical novels of the 70s, where there are rapes. So I never thought about it before, but you're probably right. A lot of covers that I guess the readers who come into the genre in the 80s, just they might just take the covers as erotic, right, and really sexy. But if you had been introduced to them through the novels with the rape scenes, it might seem a lot more sinister. I hadn't actually thought about that.
And it's probably that gap filling that you were talking about.
Yes.
So if you've been reading those type, you would have read it. Oh, well, this is just another trope that you have to go through in order to get to the part that you want to read. But if you hadn't been introduced to that trope, then possibly you're quite disconcerted.
Because I guess the novelists themselves also shift in terms of what they're doing in the sexual plots, right? I mean, Joanna Lindsay, who's one of the most long-lived,
I remember
romance novelist, historical romance novel. So her first novel, Captive Bride, which is again a rehash of the plot of The Sheikh, E.M. House, The Sheikh. So that has a rape scene in it as well, but subsequent ones do not. She's got boyish characters, heroes, and all of that as well. So it changes over time. But I think also reader reception changes over time. So and one of the things I guess that the internet has done is to give researchers fantastic access to readers' thoughts about these books, through Amazon reviews, through their own, fan sites and all of that kind of stuff. And I remember reading Amazon reviews of Lindsay's first novel, Captive Bride, and all of these people were saying, this hero really should be locked up behind a supermax, He is psychotic.
He's a sexual menace. You know what I love? I love the Smart Bitches Trashy Books website.
Oh, yes.
And they do these.
Sarah Wendell's.
Yeah, they do such beautiful reviews of romance novels, and also the covers.
Yes.
And I love those takedowns of the covers where they point out that if you were in this position, you would have like severe back trauma. So I like that mixture of like tongue-in-cheek kind of irreverence towards the genre, but also a love for the genre as well.
Yes.
That site encapsulates.
Yes, I think I think Candy Town is not involved in it anymore. But like Sarah and Wendell and Candy Town, when they first started that, it was such a creative and really original website. And one of the things they did, I think, which has really revolutionized romance scholarship, is that they gave a voice to readers. And the reader got the chance to be the critic on the Smart Bitches Trashy novels website. So I love the reviews. I mean, some of the readers are more witty, more rude, and more completely insulting than you could ever be as an academic.
All the things you wish you could say. We've only got a few minutes left, but before we go, I thought I would ask, do you have any recommendations, particularly interesting romance writers that are writing at the moment?
Okay. I think Jennifer Cruzy is always good for a laugh. She's like, she's your basic Friday night rom-com, right? But I particularly like the work of Courtney Milan, whom I mentioned earlier, because when she decided to leave Harlequin and to self-published, it took her off in all kinds of directions. And she's another one. I learned so much about 18th century British law because she had explored the archives at Newgate Jail, right? So her books are incredibly well researched. They're not all about the aristocracy. She also features, I guess, I think she's got a prostitute in one of them or something like that. So, and then, as I said, her more contemporary ones, Trade Me, that is dealing with Asian Americans, so I think she's really interesting, Courtney Milan. Another novelist that I'm really enjoying at the moment is Jeannie Lin. So she writes historical novels about the Tang Dynasty in very, very complex ways. I learned a lot about the Tang Dynasty. I had to Google a lot of the stuff to work out what was truly historical and what was not. But you could see that she'd done her research. So those are two novelists, and I guess three novelists, Jenny Cruzy as well, who's a perennial favorite. That I enjoy reading quite a bit.
Jimmy, are there any ones that you are reading at the moment?
Oh, look, I haven't read anything since the 90s, basically, but I am interested in that Tang Dynasty one you talked about. So, I wouldn't mind reading those. But look, my old favourite is the one that I mentioned, Judith McNaught. I absolutely love her work, and I don't know why it is, but I could read through them very, very quickly, and usually do read through them fairly quickly. So
it's romance, it's the plottiness of it.
It's the binge reading, dream really, because you can just get through them so quickly, and that's probably why that proliferation you were talking about, romance readers are voracious readers, and they can just really get through it because it's such an easy read, and you're also learning things quite in a fun way. It's not a dry way. This happened and this happened, this happened. You're given a context and a narrative to actually get into. So that would be my recommendation. And probably Sandra Brown. I do have a soft spot for
Sandra
her.
Brown.
And I love that blending of crime and romance. There's something exciting about it. So maybe you're right. There is something sexy about murder.
I've never read any crime romance. Now I think I'm going to have to.
Yeah, but I guess, and it's not just in the genre itself. Persuasion is still one of my favorite romance novels, right? Jane Austen's Persuasion.
It's the most romantic of Jane Austen's novels, I think.
It's that long declaration where he completely admits that he was totally in the wrong.
It's that letter.
It's every woman's dream, isn't
it?
Oh
my God! Imagine getting a letter like that.
Yes.
Good letter. You were right.
You were right. Everything you ever said was right, and I love and adore you so much. It's like
very romantic.
Okay, I'll marry you now.
God.
Yes, and of course, A.S. Byatt's Position, every time I leave it for a few years and I go back and I think, oh, that was such a well-crafted book. Yeah.
I'm going to have to put in a plug for my favourite, Georgette Heyer.
Okay.
My one and only true love.
Which one?
Oh God, they're all so good. But I think Arabella is a favourite. The Grand Sophie, although that has a really offensive part that I try to ignore. Venetia, actually, probably is my favourite.
Okay.
And I do love Regency Bark and that kind of series
you
as
like
well.
all the alpha males.
I like all the alpha males.
Because my favourite
disturbing.
Of hers, my favourite of hers is Cotillion.
Oh, I do love Cotillion.
I love
Freddie.
Cotillion. I mean, Freddie is such an idiot,
But he's so adorable.
Yes, he is. And she made, like an anti-hero into a hero. It's clever.
I do like the Mark II heroes as well. But for some reason her alpha heroes really work for me in ways that is quite disturbing. Actually, and a modern romance novelist that I'm really enjoying at the moment is Sarah McLean.
Oh, right, okay.
Her books are kind of, I think they're a bit ahistoric in her representation of the Regency, and her characters seem very modern, although they live in 1825. Yeah. I think that she's obviously working off higher there. But I really enjoy her Scandals and Scoundrels series, where she obviously takes some kind of idea from the contemporary world and translates it into a kind of early 19th century context. So there was one in which the plot hinges on a naked painting, and its capacity to destroy the life of the woman who is being painted. And it's obviously about it's not really about naked paintings. It's obviously really about like naked photos being distributed online and the impact that they have on girls these days. And so she draws some interesting parallels, and I just really like her writing. So.
Okay, I haven't read her, but I must. Yes.
Sarah McLean, yes, that is my recommendation. Now we have completely run out of time. Thank you, Hsu-Ming. That was so wonderful.
Thank you, Steph and Jimmy.
Pleasure.
Thank you, Jimmy, for copping to a love of romance novels. Very brave of you.
Brave, what can I say?
It's an alpha hero thing to do.
Yeah, it is very alpha of you. Yes. So thank you, everyone. This has been another episode of From the Lighthouse. If you could rate and review the podcast on iTunes, that would be really helpful. Please send through any feedback and suggestions for future episodes as well. And we will see you in 2 weeks. We miss you, Michelle.